Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Amy Davies, and we're going to talk about internalized pressure and how this can impact our nervous system and our recovery. And I think the first question we're going to do is, what on earth do you mean by that? But before we get into that, Amy, would you like to just start by saying a few words about who you are and what you do?
Jackie, thanks so much for having me. So I'm Amy, and I'm an embodiment coach and somatic practitioner. And I mainly work with people with fatigue-related conditions like long COVID, ME/CFS, and also chronic pain as well. And I came to this work following my own health journey with chronic pain and fatigue that I developed back in 2018. And part of the reason why I came to this work was because I needed it myself. And then I found such a passion for it. And that's how things sort of moved from them.
Yeah, so you have walked this walk, let's say.
Oh, yes, yes. I've bought all the t-shirts.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I'm delighted to have you here today. And I think this is a really important topic. We were just chatting a little bit before we hit record, and it turns out that we have a lot in common. No surprises there. And have both kind of experienced this kind of pressure and the negative impacts of it on recovery. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this. And I think we've got a lot to share. So, before we kind of dive into it any further, can you talk a little bit what you mean by internalized pressure for anyone who is not quite sure what we're on about?
Absolutely. And I've been using this term more sort of in how I communicate my work and with clients because I find it encapsulates so much. So, our nervous system, first and foremost, is kind of like our body's threat detector. So it signals when something isn't quite right. It's that, okay, this is a threat. And a lot of processes, neurobiological in the body ensue, and this is what can contribute towards symptoms as well. And when we are experiencing pressure, this keeps the nervous system in high alert. So it's kind of like the alarm bells ringing, the threat detectors sounding. And when we're working with fatigue conditions, we want to try and calm the nervous system down to bring it into a healthier state. And that's not that it's got to be calm all the time, because we'd be robots if we were calm all the time. We want to be able to move in and out of state. So actually, when we need that alarm system, actually, we need to be able to act on that. There's nothing wrong with being stressed or angry, etc. What we want is for that to be an appropriate response to the stimulus that's going on at the time. And we want to be able to move out of that state so that it's not so depleted, because we're not designed to be in these high activation states for really long periods of time. We want them more to be short, sharp bursts when we need them, and then to be able to come out of those high intensity states. And with fatigue conditions, it often is that I remember a doctor described it to me sort of very early on when I was being diagnosed. He was like, it's kind of got a bit stuck. It's like the alarm signal's on all the time. I was like, Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can feel that. And it's very hard to get it out of that stuck mode. And I think one of I sometimes say it feels like a catch-22, or it just feels like a big cosmic joke that the universe has a dark sense of humor about it. But actually, we're in these heightened stress states, and then the illnesses or the conditions themselves are very, very stressful. So, actually, on top of that existing level of, sort of the alarm signal sounding, the conditions themselves throw in all this extra stress that makes it very, very hard to come out of those states. And we also need to do this very, very slowly, as the nervous system doesn't like big, big changes because it also thinks of that as a threat. So again, we're back to that catch-22, cosmic joke style of things. Um, so we want to work on helping drip feed signals of actually things are okay. We don't need to be on such high alert to the nervous system. And we can do that through a number of different ways. There's body-based practices, lifestyle changes, reframing thoughts. It can be down to, the foods we eat, etc. But doing this in a way that is sort of slow, gradual, and consistent so that we're not overwhelming things as well, because the nervous system also likes familiarity. And when we try and change stuff too quickly, it's like, whoa, 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 I don't like this, and I'm seeing this as a threat. So again, why this can be so tricky to work with. Um, and I think we can often see a lot of external pressures quite easily. So, say if we're like, well, I'm really unwell and I can't work and therefore I can't get paid, that's a huge, huge stressor. It's a lot of pressure, understandably. And also, the illness itself, where we're like, actually, I'm in a lot of pain, or I'm not able to do the things that I like to do. And, that's a very oversimplified, there's so many facets of this stuff. So there's these big external pressures, but then the internalized pressure is often like a second layer that I see quite a lot. And I've lived quite a lot as well. I'm not talking about this from a place of, oh, actually, we shouldn't do this, because that can be pressure as well. It's incredibly human and natural that we do this. But internalized pressure can be things around maybe putting a lot of pressure on ourselves to get better by an arbitrary deadline, which again makes so much sense. Why wouldn't we want to be better? That pattern might have served us really well in life in different scenarios. Maybe when we had to complete the qualification or finish work or help out a family member, those skills are really helpful. But when we apply it to our health, when we're in this activated state that's got a little bit stuck, that can feel like extra pressure. And our nervous system can almost double down on that as well, because it feels like, oh, actually, this, this is quite, this is a lot of pressure and I can't do that. It can come up around self-criticism, a lot of classic protective mechanisms that can contribute towards these types of health conditions. So things like perfectionism, excess thinking or intellectualizing, um, maybe having a history of being, the achiever, the one that always got the good grades, never caused anyone any problems, was always there to help people out. And then there's other more nuanced takes on this as well. So some people that maybe feel that they've had to mask a lot through life, that might be through self-protective mechanisms. It might be that someone identifies with neurodiversity and they're like, actually, this is something that I've done from a very young age that I probably didn't realize that I was doing. It's all it's all ways of having internalized pressure. It's all different facets and threads of, actually, I can't just be me, however I am in this moment, and feel okay in my body to do that. And often for really good reason. There's loads of systemic reasons why we can't do that. If we even think in the workplace, particularly in the past where it's like, oh, I can't show up and just be like, actually, I feel terrible. I don't want to be here, etc. Some of us are paid to, um, or have been paid to, give off a presentation of, oh, yes, customer service roles, that type of thing, or very public facing roles where people do need to um, present in a certain way or do need to meet certain goals and deadlines, etc. So I use this term of internalized pressure because it does encapsulate so much. It's absolutely huge, and I will have missed out lots of ways that it does come up. And also, this is very personal as well. So I've given very generalized examples. It'll come up for people in particularly personal ways. But I think sometimes working with that, oh, okay, where's the pressure? Whether that is internalized or not. I think we mentioned before we hit record that sometimes we can get very perfectionistic about recovery. I need to be doing all these protocols or different regimes and things, which is perfectionism again. It's wearing a different hat. It's very understandable because why wouldn't we want to feel better? And we live in a society that's always given us the messages of actually, if you just try hard enough, if you keep going, or if you find the magical thing, I'll say in air quotes, that's the way through this. Whereas so much of that often falls down with these types of health conditions. And this isn't saying, there's a lot of things that are very helpful, but if we try and do too much at once, and there's that intention of either force or worry behind it, then that's giving off that implication of internalized pressure as well. So I think just sort of opening it out, I'll often say to people, actually, where's the pressure right now? And let's, really zoom out and see where it's coming from. How does that feel in your body? And then people can get quite curious about what might be coming up for them. And there is the stuff that we really, can't avoid. A lot of the external stuff that might be going on. We need to pay our bills still when we're unwell, unfortunately, and there are certain demands there. But maybe noticing, okay, what's the narrative that's playing out for me around this, or how's my body responding to it? It's not always at the level of conscious thought. And then we can start, sort of exploring those layers of internalized pressure and maybe just giving light to some things where we're like, oh, actually, this is a really rubbish situation, but then there's all these angles where it's becoming extra hard because of, certain beliefs or patterns, again, that are all completely human. Why wouldn't they be playing out? Why wouldn't we be thinking this is the way to go? Because we've often done that for a really long time. It's worked really well in other areas of life, and it's generally what we're told to do.
Yeah, and I think you've given a really great overview there. And what really struck me as you were speaking was that, there are a lot of pressures from outside. And I think we tend to be much more aware of the pressure from outside. We know that we have financial stress. We know that we have friends and family members that are relying on us who maybe are so desperate for us to get better that they're putting a whole load of pressure on us that they probably don't intend. But we're probably quite aware of some of them, if not all of them. Whereas these internalized pressures tend to be much more unconscious, I think, certainly in my experience, until I started working on this stuff and speaking to other people and working with my therapist, who definitely played a huge role in my recovery and I think needs more credit than I ever gave her. You know, I was completely unaware of the internal pressure that I was putting on myself on top of all of the external pressures. And I think you made a really great point that we can't avoid everything, you know, but we can make things a little bit easier for ourselves if we have that little bit of awareness. And it reminds me of you've probably come across this before, the first and the second arrow. And it's a slightly different take, but kind of similar in that, isn't it? The first arrow is the things that have happened already or the things that we maybe can't avoid. And the second arrow is how we respond to that, or maybe the things that we are able to have some control over. So maybe your first arrow, kind of in this slightly altered metaphor, would be your external pressures that you can't avoid, or maybe you can avoid some of them, but the ones that you can't. And then this internalized pressure is that second arrow that actually we can, if we bring a little bit of awareness into this, start to think, okay, maybe I could let go of that. Maybe I could give myself an easier ride here, and that would take a little bit of the pressure off. But I think so much of it is about awareness, but awareness with compassion as well, not awareness with that kind of like, oh, you idiot, why haven't you worked this out yet? Because that was certainly my first response. How could you be so stupid to put all this extra pressure on yourself?
And I see it as well, that there's, and I see this in my own personal experience. There's so many layers
Yeah,
to it as well, but then we can almost get to the point where we then beat ourselves up for being perfectionist about recovery. We get into that trap and then it's like, oh, this is what I'm doing, or oh yeah, I'm adding extra pressure on. And it sort of sneaks in a little bit. And I think with a lot of this, we might not always, well, again, however someone chooses to label it, but we're sort of in the territory of shame when that starts to sneak in, which is a bodily experience. I know just as I'm talking about it, I'm like, oh, it doesn't feel very nice. It's sort of like, oh, it's like, oh, it's the little gremlin that's sat in the corner going, oh, yes, how can we make you feel bad right now? I know. This might all already be terrible. I can make you feel a little bit worse by, thinking, oh, actually, now this is my fault, for example, being perfectionist around recovery or for pushing through or whatever it might be. So I think that curiosity and compassion is key, and trying to hold it with a bit of lightness, so that we don't then start almost, shaming the shame or shaming the protective mechanism. Because, why on earth wouldn't you want to get out of this? Why wouldn't you put on, the achiever cap that's like, well, actually, if I just do all the things, then of course I'll be better in X amount of time. And also, why wouldn't you want to be better in that amount of time? Our human brains really like timelines. And also, I think that can sometimes be part of a coping mechanism as well, where we do give ourselves sort of timelines in our mind's eye to work towards. So I don't say any of this to knock that stuff. I think it's just, when it does come up, how can we be a little kinder to ourselves? As you say, how can we be compassionate? Um, Sometimes, not always. Again, it's individual for people. Sometimes we can smile and almost laugh to ourselves and be like, oh, this old pattern again. I know I do that quite frequently at this point. It's not always been the way. But I think it's just allowing ourselves to be more human. There's that self-awareness. And then there's like, yeah, actually, this is really messy. It is very catch-22-y. That's what I've found in my experience a lot. And I think a lot of people that I speak to resonate with that as well. But yeah, just sort of looking out for those threads where it's like, is this where the pressure's coming in? And actually, what does that need? How can I treat that? How can I treat that kindly? If that was my friend rather than me, how would I relate to it in that way?
we'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. I think that's a really good point because, like, we are usually our worst critics, I think. Um, and, of course, we have expectations of other people, but I think we tend to be much more forgiving of other people's failings than our own. And I think often, yeah, that kind of reminding ourselves, if someone else told me that they have just realized that they are, giving themselves a really hard time, would you turn around and say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. Why have you been doing that? You're a terrible person for doing that, and it's all your own fault." Of course you wouldn't. And yet somehow it's acceptable to say that stuff to ourselves. And we do over and over and over again. And I think until someone kind of turned around and said that exact kind of thing to me, I didn't realize quite how harmful it was. And I think they actually were using the term kind of mental self harm. And I thought, oof, that's heavy. And I thought, actually, you know what? Maybe it should be. Maybe it should have a name that feels heavy because actually it is.
Oh, heartbreaking, isn't it? And I think sometimes because of the nature of fatigue conditions, and not always, but that they often are so misunderstood by
Mm,
others and even people that are quite well-meaning that maybe don't have much experience of them. It's getting better, but there's still not a lot of wide information around things. When people do respond in certain ways that activate that as well, when people, do say, "Oh,
yeah.
but you look great," or "Yeah, I get tired too," all the classics that, oh, are so painful. I just use those and I just I like sigh forward when I hear that because it's like, and often people don't mean anything by it. Sometimes they do, unfortunately. But it can feel so cruel. And there's not that person there that's saying, actually, yeah, I see you. This is really, really hard. And it feels like you can't win no matter what you do. If you don't
Yeah.
push through, you're not doing anything. If you do push through, you're not getting better. And also, it doesn't feel like anyone's got a concrete answer for you and you desperately want that. It can almost feel like, people are being really left alone. And then, those voices are going to amplify a lot, the protective parts really, that are like, actually, yeah, I'm going to take control. I'm going to do what I'm doing. It can almost feel like an inner drill sergeant that might be like, well, yeah, actually, this is what we're doing. And boom, boom, boom. And it can be really self-critical. And I say that, just to see that actually there is intelligence in that. Again, I think this can help with that compassion piece. Actually, yeah, it's a really awful situation is probably a big understatement. And actually, some of our parts, our protective mechanisms, they are going to step up and be like, right, you know what? I'm going to take charge of this. And sometimes those parts might be really critical. They might be very perfectionist or very wanting to push through or whatever it might be, it'll come up differently for different people. But I think sometimes recognizing that, and sometimes we do need someone to sit with us and be like, yeah, why are you being a bit hard on yourself? And actually sometimes someone to just say, that sounds really rubbish. Even if it is, I might not fully understand what you're going through, but I hear you, I'm listening. That sounds awful. And yeah, I get that. And also, could you be a little bit kinder? Can I help you be a bit kinder? Is there anything I can do? Whether that's I'll just sit here and be with you. We can feel a bit rubbish together. It's not someone trying to fix. Because again, I think this is another thing that again is very understandable why people feel like it. The standard medical model that so many of us are used to, is about fixing, oh, actually, if I break my leg, I have, this sort of treatment and that fixes it. I'm using air quotes again. Whereas with this type of stuff, that's not really the case. And also sort of the connotation that we need fixing is that we're broken in some way and we're not. It's another way of being able to feel whole without dismissing that we're actually going through a really, really hard time with a lot of challenges that can be compounded by so much stuff, widespread misunderstanding, lack of care, I've not got enough fingers to go with, all the different things. And again, it will be different for different people. So yeah, I think it is one of those things we can get curious about. We'll probably never get it exactly right. I'm using the air quotes again, but this is because there isn't really a way of getting it exactly right. I think a lot of it, it's like, actually, can I work with building trust that it's okay to be a bit more human and that actually, yeah, this is how I can navigate it. There's not a perfect way. And how can I be as kind to myself as possible along the way? And sometimes that'll be, oh, I notice that I've been really unkind to myself, but also that's a protective part trying to do its thing.
Yeah, and I think, this allowing ourselves to be human thing is possibly one of the most important things in the whole journey, isn't it? And, you
Absolutely.
know, it'll, as you say, show up in different ways for different people, whether it's, I have to be perfect. And therefore, striving for all of that, which, we'll never achieve because perfectionism is impossible. But we will keep trying to achieve. Or it might be things like people pleasing or not being able to show emotions. I mean, how many of us have been told to just pull yourself together or grow up or, men don't cry, those sorts of things, like the world tells us these things that it is, it's not okay to be not perfect or it's not okay to be human and that we should constantly be. I mean, like every advert that you see on TV, right, is all about like what we should be. Well, what's wrong with how I am now? Kind of thing. And it's like, how can we be more happy with what we have rather than striving for something more. And that's really challenging, I think, when we're unwell, because of course we're unhappy with what we have because we're unwell and our entire world has fallen apart and we can't do any of the things that we want to do. We can't even do the things that we maybe need to do, like work and wash and make food and things. So it's really, really challenging, I think, in that sort of situation. But it's also if we've spent our whole lives trying to be more than, it's also something that it doesn't come naturally to us. And I think it's like it's got to be that balance, hasn't it? Coming back to what you were saying about, you find some things that help. And certainly for me, I did find some things that helped. And it was like, okay, amazing, this is great. And I then took it and I ran with it, not literally. And I said, right, okay, and overscheduled myself. So my whole day was mapped out with my breathing and then my yoga and then my this and my that. And, it was like this whole thing that had started out as I found a few things that helped me had turned into this huge amount of pressure that I was putting onto myself. So I'd taken things that helped me and made them into something that didn't, that was putting additional pressure on myself. And then when things weren't getting better, so recovery had stalled, that was then my fault because I wasn't trying hard enough. Well, certainly that's how I felt at the time. And like, I've seen this in people I've worked with, people I've spoken to, and from what you've said, it sounds like you have had some similar experiences. And like, how do we find a balance between motivating ourselves to consistently do the right things that help us? And that's obviously very individualized. So finding the balance between that and not tipping over into the overscheduling, the pressure, the additional internalized crap that we put on top of ourselves. Like, how do we find the balance between the two?
Well, first and foremost, it is super tricky, isn't it? And I work at this stuff all the time. I'm not sitting here saying, "Oh, I've got this sorted." I think it's hard. And
Nailed this.
yes, I don't think, I probably never will. I think it is having that curiosity. And I think having that curiosity, particularly over time, in the beginning, it can feel like a very dedicated sort of practice. And often we need those dedicated practices of that, things like meditation or self-reflection. But also over time, it just sort of becomes a way of life. So it becomes something that, we're not always consciously thinking we need to do. Um, but yeah, as practical tips, I'd sort of say, firstly, we can recognize, there's whole industries built on comparison. If we think about marketing, whether that's marketing over a car or an outfit that we need to buy, or the latest supplement we should take, or a certain exercise that we should be doing or something. And this isn't to knock, some of these things. There's some, really good stuff out there. But also, just having that sense of, well, actually, this is something that's being presented. It's very external. And also, we don't always know everything that's going on for someone. We see so much of people. I think comparison can be a real tricky one. And our brains, they like to compare, but they do it. Sort of the neuroscience of comparison often is where, we see someone who's maybe where we want to be, and then our brain identifies the gap. And the gap is usually quite big because we're maybe seeing an idealized version of that person, or we've not got all the details. Or again, they're just working with a completely different set of conditions than we are, or at a different point in their time frame. So, comparison isn't always that helpful. And sometimes it can feel like pressure because we can be like, oh, well, I want to be doing that. And that feels so far away from where I currently am. Whereas that person might just have very different circumstances. So actually doing that thing or whatever it is, it's not an equal comparison as such. Or also, we don't see all the stuff going on behind the scenes. We don't see all the hardship there. We don't see, maybe how long that took and all the little parts of the puzzle that sort of built up to that. And even when people do um, recount things, often how we talk about something um, at certain points can differ, sort of when we reflect on something that maybe happened 5 years ago or 10 years ago, within our personal experience, it's still very true, it's still very authentic, but how we communicate that might be quite different, sort of further down the road when we're not quite so in it. Our levels of reflection when we look back on things when we've had a bit of space in time are quite different as well. So I think, to sort of pull it back in, I think a lot of it is how can we, be curiously compassionate and notice actually, yeah, there's a lot of things out there. Um, there's a lot of marketing around things, whether that's conscious or unconscious, like we're all supposed to be having the perfect life and doing the wonderful thing and being happy all the time. Even if, this isn't illness related, this is just society as such, whereas that often doesn't go anywhere near um, touching what it is to be a human being, that, we'll all have hardship in different ways. We'll all have struggles. Life's not the constant happy state that it's almost presented as it should be. And also then that blame of, oh, and it's probably because you're doing something wrong if it's not constantly like that. If you just optimized a bit more, or if you just did this or the other. Um, and this is a generalization, but if it does resonate with people, most people with fatigue related conditions probably did spend years, if not decades, optimizing beforehand. It often is people that have, worked very hard, done a lot of things, have been very kind and giving to people, have excelled, have pushed, sort of those types of things. So it can feel like, oh, well, actually, these skills worked in other ways. And, I've sort of signed up for this ideal that, well, actually, if you just work hard enough, you get X result. And there can be a lot of grief in that as well. That doesn't show to be the case, particularly when we get into these health struggles. And for other people, it might show up in different areas of life. So yeah, I think a lot of it is building self-trust. It can be almost how can I maybe move away from some of the comparisons? How can I calm the parts of me that are maybe like, I need to read every piece of research. I need to try every single program. I should do every supplement, every test. And again, I'm not telling people not to do those things. Some of those things can be helpful, but to be able to pace ourselves and get curious around the intention around it. Is it very fear-based again, which is human if it is, but noticing, is it very fear-based or does it feel right? And there'll often be um, I sometimes speak to clients, there'll be a few things that they're sort of like, oh, actually, the fear-based part of me wants to try absolutely everything. Um, if I sit with it and sort of support it and calm it and sort of question, well, actually, if I tried one or two things now, tried it out for a little bit, see how that goes. What are the things that are resonating with me now? And there'll usually be, maybe a couple of things that resonate more than others. Um, and again, people can test it out and then they can test out something else if that doesn't feel right. But yeah, I think it is that curiosity, that self-awareness, noticing, actually what does it feel like when fear is behind the wheel? Because it's very understandable. It's not knocking this, but also if we don't know that's that, we just think that that's the way it is. We just think this is the journey. Whereas we're like, oh, actually, maybe fear's behind the wheel at the moment, or maybe perfectionism is. It can just sort of help loosen it a little bit. Where we might be like, oh yeah, so maybe that is helpful. Maybe I do want to try that, but maybe it's not quite as urgent as it feels in this moment. And it just sort of opens up our options a little bit, and it does give that space to be human, to have that space of not knowing. Sometimes that's really tricky, and it can be so hard when most of us, we have always been brought up, if you're unwell, you go to the doctor. They'll know what it is, they'll tell you what to do, there'll be a very clear plan. And then something like this, where that's not the case, that's, again, it feels like understatement of the century, that's super hard. So noticing, well, yeah, part of me will feel really alone. Part of it, fear will want to take control, or, our inner drill sergeant, or whatever it is. But just having that curiosity, having that compassion, and giving it a little bit of space. Because when we are in stress states of whatever kind, urgency is a real characteristic of that. So everything can feel like, actually, this needs doing right now, if not a week ago. And that can lead to, again, a lot of panic, a lot of urgency, a lot of doing, but actually just being able to create a little bit of space, which sometimes might just be for a few seconds of, oh, actually, can I breathe out for a moment? Can I notice that, I'm being really unkind to myself right now? Sometimes that's all that we need. We can't always solve these things, but actually, if we can slow things down a bit, that's helping the nervous system move out of the threat detector level, and just helping us see, the different parts at play that might be, actually, I feel like I've got to solve this by tomorrow. Which, why wouldn't we think that way? But also, there's people throughout the world have been, it's their jobs to try and work on this stuff. And, no one's got one exact answer yet, have they? So we can, I say that just to say, we can reduce the pressure on ourselves as well. And there can be a lot of grief and hardship in that, particularly when we are feeling really unwell. So a lot of it is sort of building that capacity to really sit with the discomfort and to get support with that when we need to as well, because we don't have to be perfect and superhuman and be like, well, I need to do all this by myself, or I've got to white knuckle sitting with all my feelings and, pausing, etc. And then finding the things that do help and knowing, actually, whatever we do, if we do one tiny thing, that's enough, and we can build on that, and it won't be linear. It can be more human. And I think just sort of coming back to that, actually, it's okay to be a bit more human. And all of these tiny little things, in whatever way they resonate, whatever way we can carry out, will be helpful. And that can all just sort of help calm down that internalized pressure.
We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I think for me, there was a couple of things that you said that stood out. And one was that it's okay to not know. And I think, certainly for me, and I think again, a lot of people I've spoken to, we are total control freaks and have been probably our entire lives. Have always been the one to try and be in control, in charge, because, if you need a job done, you do it yourself. And then suddenly we're in a situation where we have even less control than we ever did before. And I think, certainly one of the things that have helped me is realizing that actually we have very little control over anything, even when we're well. But when we're unwell, we have even less control. And, so we will scrabble around and try to find anything that we can to hold on to because we're trying so hard to find something that we can control. And, actually, sometimes that isn't helpful. So that reminder that, like, it's okay to not have the answers, it's okay to not be in control. It feels utterly terrifying, but it is okay. So, kind of reminding ourselves of that. But I think the other thing that really struck me, which was something that I really struggled with, was the kind of it's okay to start something and not continue with it. Because to me, that always felt like giving up. If I started something, I was damn well going to finish it. And actually, like, again, there's always a balance, isn't there? If we stumble at the first hurdle, then we'll never get anywhere. But at the same time, if we continue doing something that we know isn't helping, then that's not right either. So there's got to be a balance there. And it's okay. I think for me, my kind of perfectionism sometimes shows up in that procrastination kind of thing, where I say, oh, well, I'm going to not do it at all because then I can't fail at it. So it's like that kind of idea of try out a few different things, see what lands, and then you choose the ones that feel the most right. So try not to worry about the fact that they're not all going to be perfect. um, and I find that really hard.
It really is, isn't it? And also, just physiologically, a lot of the time when we go in towards more sort of the overwhelm responses,
Mm,
I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard like about the freeze response or elements of the freeze response. This is sort of that almost a little bit like the rabbit in headlights, that type of feeling when we're like, I just don't know what to do, which is so natural. It's subconscious, we don't choose this. But actually, in that state, doing the smallest thing can feel so hard. And that's on top of the symptoms as well. So actually giving your toes a wiggle or, taking 3 breaths or noticing that your blanket's really nice and feels good, that can actually do you the world of good. And that's probably the right level to work with because any more than that can sort of add to that overwhelm, that freeze response. And again, there's different examples in different scenarios. I just give this as a very general one. So being able to maybe, particularly when a bit of that is present, that rabbit in headlights feeling or that feeling of, oh, I feel like I should be doing everything, but I can't do anything at the same time. It might be like, actually, how can I make this really intentionally slow and as simple as possible for myself? What's one thing I might be able to do? And sometimes it might be like, actually, I'm just going to have a little look around so that, my body isn't in that rabbit in headlights place. So, so yeah, I think it is, it's just going slow. I was really what really struck me when you were talking about control as well, and hard relate as well. I put my hand up for this one personally. I think control is, it's so incredibly human, and then that can get amplified even further when things are really out of control. Just as you said, actually, when we really sit back, and this is a really scary thing about just being a human, living a human life, we don't actually have that much control. And often, you know, our drive, we can almost think that the antidote for loss of control is to control more, to have things where we can do that. Whereas I think balm really, it's often support, actually someone saying, actually, yeah, I don't know either, no one's got it all figured out, or actually, yeah, this is really scary, and I see you, I see that this is terrifying, and actually, I'll be with you for a little bit with that, without trying to fix it or change it, or strategizing the best approaches of how we could do this, that, and the other, and I'm not, there is a time and a place for that type of stuff. I'm not knocking that in appropriate doses. Um, but actually, the balm isn't often what we think it is. It's trying to come out of that need to control, which might be like, actually, what helps me feel a bit more okay. And I use the word, I really emphasize the word a bit, and sometimes that might be actually, yeah, I can just feel my feet against the ground, or, that's sat here, looking at me adoringly. I've got a warm blanket, that type of thing, or there's someone that will sit here with me, or, I listened to a podcast like yours that you put out, and I can have a sense that, oh yeah, there's other people in the world that, you know, get similar things to what I've been going through, just to have that felt sense of, oh, okay, it's not all on me, because I think often the need for control, it can be when things are really uncertain, that part can go into overdrive, and it's like, right, actually, if I just have the perfect strategy, if I just do all the things or whatever it is, then that will fix it. And then rather than calming it down, it often amplifies it, because we find more things to add to that list, or we maybe start fixating a little bit on things that don't turn out to be so helpful. Again, having that compassion, having that pause, and being like, okay, actually, what support can I find? I think that's often the balm, but that's probably the last place our mind goes to, or I know it can be for me, until I sort of pause,
Yeah.
and like, actually, yeah, maybe this means, it doesn't mean that you've got to have all this stuff figured out by, last week, not even tomorrow. Maybe it's that you need to slow down a little bit, maybe it's the opposite of what you think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've kind of talked around a lot of stuff, which is incredibly useful. And the things that I'm taking the most from what you've said is that when we are feeling that pressure, particularly from ourselves, the two most important things are taking that space and finding the little things. Forget about the big stuff, forget about the control and all the shoulds. And actually, what is one thing that I can do right now that will make me feel, as you say, a little bit more okay? And, save the big things and the big picture for when you're feeling a little bit more okay. But in this moment, what is one thing that I can do? And I think we often forget actually that big things are made of little things. And the little things, I think, are often the most powerful, because they're the things that we can do in that moment. So thank you for reminding me of that, because I definitely get caught up in the whole perfectionism and control and all of that still. And as you said, sometimes just having a little bit of a laugh at ourselves can be a beautiful way to diffuse that. And I do that often. um, Amy, thank you so much. I feel like we could continue for another hour and we would cover so much stuff, but let's leave it there because I think that's a beautiful point to leave it. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your humanness, and for allowing me to do the same. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Jackie.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.